He ran away. He abandoned everything. He left behind Egypt, the past, and the chance to become someone, for 40 years. Silence, no achievements, no signs, no evidence of purpose. If someone looked from the outside, they would say, it's over. But what no one saw was that God was still writing, because there is something almost no one understands. God is never in a hurry, but he is never late either. And at the right moment. He calls, not in the palace, not at the peak, but in the desert. And when God calls, everything changes. The fugitive receives an impossible mission. The insecure must confront an empire. And a simple staff becomes an instrument of miracles. But here is the point. Before the sea opens, before the deliverance happens, before the impossible becomes reality, Moses had to face something much harder than Pharaoh. He had to overcome himself. Today, you will see what happens when God decides to use someone who thinks they are not ready. You will understand why the process is so silent. And how the impossible begins, long before it appears. Because the truth is only one. The desert was not the end of Moses. It was the beginning of the calling. And after that, nothing was ever the same again. He was born in the middle of chaos. At a time when the people of Israel were not just foreigners, but enslaved, oppressed, reduced to labor for an empire that feared the growth of a people. It could not control Egypt, the greatest power of that time, ruled by a pharaoh who did not know the story of Joseph, nor respected the God of Israel. And it was in this scenario that a cruel decree was established. Every Hebrew boy should die, but one of them survived. Placed inside a basket, sent into the waters of the Nile with no guarantee of a future. Only a silent hope. This boy grew up inside the very palace that ordered his death, raised as a prince, educated as an Egyptian, prepared to rule, but carrying within him an identity he did not fully understand. His name was Moses, but his story did not begin with victory. It began with a mistake. When he saw the oppression against a Hebrew, Moses acts on impulse, tries to bring justice with his own hands, and kills an Egyptian. And in that moment, everything changes. The prince becomes a fugitive. The man who once had access to the palace now runs through the desert, alone, exposed, without direction. Have you ever thought about that? How someone who seemed so promising ends up running from his own story? Did that mistake destroy the purpose? Could God still use someone who failed like that? Because from the outside, it looked like the end. But in heaven, it was only the beginning. Moses disappears from the records of Egypt. The man who could have been a leader is now just an unknown in the middle of the desert. And it is exactly there, far from the eyes, far from recognition, that God begins to write a new story. Because there is something this story reveals from the very beginning. Mistakes do not cancel purpose, and when God decides to act, neither the desert, nor the past, nor failures can stop it. The question now is no longer who Moses was, but who he is about to become, and it is in the silence of the desert that everything begins to change. The desert was not just a place, it was a process. After fleeing Egypt, Moses crosses arid regions, far from Egyptian influence, until he reaches the land of Midian, a region inhabited by nomadic peoples, descendants of Abraham through Midian, son of Keturah. There, he was no longer a prince, nor a known fugitive. He was just another tired man, without title, without position, without recognition. And perhaps, for the first time, without control. Egypt was left behind, but the questions still followed him. And now, the scene changes completely. No palace, no authority, no luxury. Now there is dust, intense sun, and silence. Lot of silence, but it is in this silence that something unexpected happens. As he approaches a well, a vital point for survival in the desert, Moses witnesses a common situation in that culture. Shepherds trying to drive women away to take possession of the water. The women were daughters of Jethro, priest of Midian, a respected man in that region, spiritual leader and head of his family. Even far from Egypt. Something inside Moses still reacts. He intervenes. He defends those women. He drives the shepherds away. And for the first time since his escape, he uses his strength not out of uncontrolled impulse, but to protect. Do you see the difference? There is still courage. But now direction begins to emerge. The women return home earlier than usual, and Jethro finds it strange. Upon hearing what happened, he calls Moses, and that encounter changes the course of the story, because the fugitive finds shelter. Moses is welcomed, received, integrated. With time, he marries Zipporah, one of Jethro's daughters, builds a family, has a son, Gershom, and by giving him that name, he reveals what he still carried inside himself. I am a foreigner in a strange land. Even while building a new life, Moses still feels displaced. And perhaps here lies one of the most silent and deepest parts of this story. The years pass, not days. Not weeks, years, decades. About 40 years living as a shepherd. Taking care of sheep, guiding flocks, learning to deal with time, with rhythm, with patience. Can you imagine that? A man who was raised at the center of power, now lives in absolute anonymity. No audience. No. RECOGNITIONNO signs that something extraordinary is still going to happen. But this is exactly where many are mistaken. Because the desert was never a waste. It was preparation. In Egypt, Moses learned to be someone. In the desert, he learns to depend on God. In Egypt, he had status. In the desert, he develops character. In Egypt, he acted on impulse. Asterisk in the desert, he learns to wait. And perhaps this is one of the hardest truths to accept. God works in silence. Asterisk, while no one sees. He is shaping. Asterisk, while it seems like nothing is happening. Everything is being prepared. Asterisk, while Moses thought his story had been interrupted. God was just changing the setting. Asterisk, and in the middle of this silence, something begins to happen. Asterisk, far from Egypt, but not out of God's reach. Asterisk, because there comes a moment when the invisible process meets the visible calling. Asterisk, and when that happens, nothing remains the same. The desert always seemed the same. Repeated days, familiar paths, sheep, dust, silence. But there are moments when the ordinary is interrupted by the eternal dot, and that is exactly what happened. On a seemingly normal day, Moses leads the flock beyond the desert to the region of Horeb, known as the mountain of God. Nothing indicated that day would be different until something catches his attention. A flame, a fire, in the middle of a bush. What at first glance could seem common in the desert. After all, heat and fire were not rare. Quickly becomes something impossible to ignore. The bush was burning, but it was not consumed. The fire remained. Without destroying. It made no sense. And it is interesting to notice this. God did not start with a voice. He started with a sign that awakened curiosity. Moses could have ignored it. He could have continued on his way. But he does something that changes everything. He decides to come closer. I will go and see this great sight. And sometimes that is exactly what God expects. That someone stops, that someone observes, that someone comes closer. And when Moses takes that step, God speaks. Moses. Moses. It was not a generic call. It was personal. Direct. Intimate. And Moses' response reveals something that was still alive within him. Here I am. Even after years in the desert, he still responds. But what happens next completely changes the scene. Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. The desert is now holy. Not because of the place itself, but because of God's presence. And here begins one of the deepest revelations in the entire biblical story. God introduces himself. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses hides his face. He understands. He is not before just any manifestation. He is before the God of the covenant, the God who made promises, the God who does not forget. And then God reveals the reason for that encounter. I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. Do you see that? God was not distant. He saw. I have heard their cry. He heard. I know their sufferings. He cares. And then comes the statement that changes everything. I have come down to deliver them. It is not just an observation. It is an intervention. God is stepping into the story, but not in the way Moses expected, because right after that, God says, "Now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt." Silence. The man who fled from Egypt is now being sent back. The anonymous shepherd now receives an impossible mission. And perhaps for a moment, everything Moses buried in the desert comes back to the surface. The past, the mistake, the fear. Because one thing is to know that God will act. Another thing is to realize that he wants to act through you. And as if that were not enough, Moses asks a question that would echo through generations. If they ask me what his name is, what should I say? And then God answers with one of the most powerful declarations in the entire Bible. I am who I am. Not a common name, not a limited identity, but a revelation of eternal existence. God depends on nothing. He does not change. He simply is. The God who always was, the God who is, and the God who always will be. And it is this God who is sending Moses. But here is the central point. The calling did not come when Moses was ready. It came when he was available. After years in silence, after a past marked by mistakes, after a seemingly ordinary life, God appears. And when God calls, everything changes, but not always, immediately. Because the next step will not be instant courage. It will be internal. Confrontation. Fear. Insecurity. Resistance. Because before facing Pharaoh, Moses will still need to face himself. The fire was still burning. The presence of God was still there. The calling had already been released. But inside Moses, something was holding him back, because hearing God's voice is one thing. Accepting what he asks is something completely different. And then begins one of the most honest dialogues in the entire Bible. No filters. No religiosity. No ready-made answers. Just a man and his insecurities. Who am I? To go to Pharaoh? This is not just a question. It is a reflection of everything he became in the desert. The prince disappeared. The confident man stayed in the past. Now, before God, Moses sees himself as small, incapable. And perhaps here is something many people feel, but do not admit. When God calls, the first reaction is almost never courage. It is doubt. But God does not respond like someone who argues about human abilities. He does not say, "You can do it." He says something much deeper. "I will be with you." Do you see the difference? The answer is not in Moses. It is in the presence. But Moses is not finished yet. And what if they do not believe me? Now it is no longer about identity. It is about acceptance. What if I am rejected? Because deep down, perhaps he still remembered. He had already been rejected before, when he tried to help, and was exposed when he acted, and failed. And God, once again, does not ignore the doubt. He responds with signs. The staff that was in Moses' hand, something common, simple, part of a shepherd's daily life, turns into a serpent. Then it returns to being a staff. Moses' hand becomes leprous. and then is restored. Water turns into blood. They were not tricks. They were demonstrations of authority. God was saying clearly, it is not about what you have. It is about what I do through you. But even so, Moses insists, Lord, I have never been eloquent. I do not speak well. Now the resistance reaches its deepest point. He no longer questions only others' reactions. He questions himself, his limitation, his ability. His voice. And perhaps this reveals something important. Moses was not refusing the mission. He was trying to protect himself from it, because obeying that calling meant returning to the place where he failed. It meant exposing himself. It meant facing the impossible. And then God responds in a direct way, almost confrontational. Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Here there are no more gentle explanations. There is authority. God is saying, I know exactly who you are, and I am still sending you. But even after all this, Moses says something that changes the tone of the conversation. Oh, Lord, please send someone else. Now it is no longer doubt. It is resistance. It is a clear request not to go. And for the first time in the dialogue, the biblical text shows something different. The Lord's anger burns against Moses. Not because he had doubts, but because he was refusing. Even so, God does not abandon him. He provides help. Aaron, his brother, will be his voice. He will speak to the people. He will be support. And here is something powerful. God did not give up on Moses. Even when Moses tried to give up on the mission, he adjusts the path, but does not cancel the purpose. And then finally, after questions, signs, resistance, and confrontation, Moses decides to obey, not because he now feels ready, but because he understands he cannot run from the calling. He returns to Jethro. Asks permission to go back to Egypt, organizes his family. And begins the journey back to the place he once fled from. But now, he does not return as a prince. He does not return as a fugitive. He returns as someone sent by God. And that changes everything, because the next step will not be only internal. It will be public. It will be direct confrontation, and not with just anyone, but with the most powerful man of that time. Pharaoh. The journey back to Egypt was not just geographical. It was emotional. It was spiritual. Every step Moses took toward Egypt was a step back into his past, the place where he failed, the place he fled from, the place that, humanly speaking, would not welcome him well. But this time, he was not going alone. God had promised his presence, and that changed everything. Upon arriving, Moses meets Aaron, two brothers, two men with different stories, but now united by one purpose. They go to the elders of Israel, the leaders of the Hebrew people. There, Moses shares everything: the encounter with God, the calling, the promises. Aaron speaks. Moses confirms with signs, and something unexpected happens. The people believe. After years of slavery, suffering and silence. Hope begins to rise. They bow down. They worship because they heard something they perhaps had not heard in a long time. God saw. God heard. God remembered. But the real test was still to come, because one thing is to speak to the oppressed people. Something completely different is to confront the oppressor. Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh, not as politicians, not as negotiators, but as messengers. And the message is direct. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go. It is not a request, it is a command. But Pharaoh responds with something that reveals his heart. Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice? This question is not curiosity, it is arrogance. Pharaoh was considered a god in Egypt, the highest authority. To him, there was no one above, and there begins a confrontation that goes far beyond. Moses against Pharaoh, it is God confronting an entire system. Pharaoh refuses, but he does not stop there. He increases the oppression. If before the Hebrews received straw to make bricks, now they receive none. But the required amount remains the same. The work becomes heavier. The suffering increases. And suddenly, obeying God seems to have made everything worse. Have you ever noticed how this sometimes happens? You obey, and instead of things getting better, it seems like everything gets harder. That is exactly what happened here. The Hebrew foremen are punished. The people begin to despair, and then something even harder happens. They turn against Moses. It's your fault. The one who came to deliver is now seen as responsible for the suffering. Rejection, pressure, frustration, and Moses feels the weight of it. He returns to God and, in a sincere, almost desperate way, asks, Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Why did you send me? Do you see? The same man who said, here I am, is now dealing with the consequences of obedience. And perhaps this is one of the most real parts of this story. Obedience does not always bring immediate relief. Sometimes it exposes the conflict. But God responds, and he does not give long explanations. He gives a promise. Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. As if to say, it's not over. Yet, because the confrontation is just beginning. And what comes next will not be only resistance. It will be a clear demonstration of power. All of Egypt is about to witness something it has never seen before. And Pharaoh is about to discover who the Lord is. God's silence. Ended. Now, what was invisible begins to become impossible to ignore. Moses returns before Pharaoh. No longer with doubts, no longer trying to argue. Now there is clear direction, defined authority. The staff in his hand is no longer just a piece of wood. It is an instrument, and when God begins to act, the scene changes completely. The first plague comes directly. The waters of the Nile, the source of life in Egypt, the base of the economy, symbol of sustenance, turn into blood. Asterisk, the river that sustained the empire, now becomes unusable. Asterisk, fish die. The smell spreads. The water cannot be drunk. Asterisk, and here there is something deep. God is not only showing power, he is confronting what Egypt trusted in. Asterisk, but Pharaoh hardens his heart. And then come the frogs. They come out of the river and invade everything. Asterisk, houses, rooms, beds, kitchens. There is no rest. There is no escape. Asterisk, but even so, Pharaoh's heart remains resistant. Asterisk, then come the gnats, covering people and animals. Asterisk, then flies, filling the land, and something begins to become evident. There is a separation. Asterisk, while Egypt suffers. The land of Goshen, where the Hebrews live, remains preserved. Asterisk, God is making it clear. This is not random. This is directed. Asterisk, but the confrontation intensifies. Asterisk, the livestock of Egypt are struck by disease. Sustenance begins to collapse. Boils appear on the bodies of the Egyptians. The pain is no longer only external. It is physical. Asterisk, then comes hail, a violent storm, unusual in that region, destroying crops, trees, everything exposed. Asterisk, and even then, it does not end. Locusts cover the land and devour what remains. What was left from the previous destruction now disappears completely. Asterisk, and then, one of the most impactful plagues, darkness. A darkness so dense it could be felt. For 3 days, all Egypt is plunged into darkness. But once again, where the people of Israel are, there is light. Asterisk, do you see the pattern? It is not just destruction. It is revelation. God is showing who he is, and at the same time, exposing the fragility of everything that seemed powerful. Asterisk, but even in the face of all this, Pharaoh continues to harden his heart. Sometimes he yields for a moment. Asterisk, sometimes it seems he will let the people go, but soon he goes back on his word. It is like someone who sees the truth, but refuses to accept it. Asterisk, and then the most serious moment arrives. The final plague, the most painful, the most definitive. The death of the firstborn. Asterisk, but before that happens, God gives a specific instruction to his people. Asterisk, an instruction that is not only protection, it is a symbol. It is covenant. Asterisk, each family should set apart a lamb without defect, sacrifice it, and mark the doors with the blood, because that night something would pass through the land. Asterisk, and where there was blood, death would not enter. Judgment would pass over. Asterisk, and here something eternal is established. Passover, a mark, a sign of redemption, deliverance, protection. While in Egypt there is crying, in the houses marked by blood there is preservation. Asterisk, and then, finally, Pharaoh yields, but not out of conviction, out of pain. He calls Moses and Aaron. Asterisk, and in the middle of the night, he releases the people. Asterisk, after so much resistance. Asterisk, after so much confrontation, the impossible happens. The people who were slaves are now about to leave, but there is still one last chapter, because the deliverance has begun. But it is not finished yet, and the greatest miracle is still to come. The night of deliverance was not silent, while Egypt was crying. Israel was moving. After 430 years of slavery, the people finally leave. Not as hidden fugitives, but as a marching multitude. Men, women, children, elderly, all walking toward a promise that for generations seemed distant. It was the end of a cycle, but it was not the end of the journey. God does not lead them by the shortest path. Instead, he guides the people through an unexpected route toward the desert, avoiding direct confrontation with the Philistines. Because God knew those people were not yet prepared for war. During the day, a pillar of cloud guides them. During the night, a pillar of fire lights the way. The presence of God is now not only heard, it is seen, but on the other side, something begins to change. Pharaoh, realizing he has lost his workforce, hardens his heart again. Repentance does not last. He decides to pursue. Chariots are prepared. Soldiers are summoned. The most powerful army of that time now runs after a newly freed people. And then the scene closes in. Ahead, the sea. Behind, the Egyptian army. Around, the desert. No escape route, no human strategy possible, and the people fall into despair. Was it for this that you brought us out of Egypt? It would have been better to remain slaves than to die here. Fear speaks loudly. Faith seems small. And Moses now stands before one of the greatest pressures of his life. But his response reveals something the desert built within him. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall be still. Do you see the transformation? That insecure man, full of questions, now declares confidence, not in himself, but in God. And then comes the divine instruction. Why are you crying out? Tell the people to move forward. Move forward. Where? Toward the sea. And it is at this moment that the impossible stops being an idea and becomes reality. Moses stretches out his hand over the sea. The wind blows. The waters begin to move. And what had never happened before happens. The sea opens, not partially, not symbolically, completely. A dry path appears in the middle of the waters. The people pass, step by step. Between walls of water. It was not just a miracle. It was a message. The same God who delivered is now leading, but Egypt continues to pursue. The army enters the same path. Chariots, horses, soldiers, all advancing, until God intervenes again. The wheels begin to fail. Progress becomes difficult. Control is lost. And then, at the right moment, the waters return. The sea closes. And the most powerful army on earth is completely defeated, without sword, without war. without human effort. Asterisk only by God's intervention. Asterisk, and on the other side, there is silence. The people look back. Asterisk, and for the first time, they understand. It is over. Slavery is behind them. Asterisk, the past can no longer reach them. Asterisk, the God who brought them out of Egypt also delivered them from what was coming after them. Asterisk, and there, at the edge of the sea, something new is born. Asterisk, not just a free people. Asterisk, but a people who witnessed the impossible. The boy who was placed in a basket became the man who opened the sea. Asterisk, the prince who fell became the leader who rose. Asterisk, the fugitive became a deliverer. But none of this began with strength. It began with obedience. It began in the desert. It began in silence. Asterisk, because God does not choose the most ready. He transforms the available. And perhaps the most powerful part of this story is this. Asterisk, Moses' greatest mistake did not cancel the purpose. Asterisk, in fact. It was exactly what God used to take him to the place he always intended. Asterisk, because in the end, it was not about who Moses was. It was about who God is. Asterisk, and when God decides to fulfill a purpose. Asterisk, neither the past, nor fear, nor the impossible can stop it. Moses did not end as he began. The man who once fled in fear now stands firm before the impossible. Asterisk, the one who questioned his own voice now declares words that open the sea. Asterisk, the man who felt incapable became an instrument in God's hands. But none of this happened suddenly. The transformation did not begin at the miracle. It began in the desert, in silence. Asterisk, in anonymity. Asterisk, in the days when it seemed like nothing was happening. Asterisk, because it was there that God shaped Moses' heart. Asterisk, it was there that he removed self-confidence and built dependence. Asterisk, removed impulse and formed obedience. Asterisk, removed pride and established purpose. Asterisk, and perhaps this is the most important part of this entire story. God is not looking for perfect people. He is looking for available people. Asterisk, people who, even with fear, choose to obey. Asterisk, even with doubts, decide to continue. Asterisk, even without understanding everything, take the next step. Asterisk, because when someone chooses to obey, God makes the impossible happen. The sea opens, the path appears, and what seemed like the end becomes just the beginning. Asterisk, and in the end, one truth echoes throughout this story. The mistake did not cancel the purpose. In fact, it was exactly what God used to position Moses in the right place, at the right time, to fulfill what had already been determined. Asterisk, because when God writes a story, asterisk, neither the past, nor fear, nor the impossible have the final word. Asterisk, thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next video.